Yeah, hi, my name's John Carmichael. I'm English, as you can probably tell from the accent, and I moved to Canada in 2016 and brought my trusty Jeep with me from the UK, where we rebuilt it from a wreck. Found it in around about 1976 in a field, missing most of the bodywork and painted bright pink, because we think it was a hippie wagon in the 60s and they had succeeded in crashing it in a big way. Got it for about $70 Canadian, which was a bit of a bargain at the time, and it's probably cost me several $1,000s to actually build it up to the stage that it's at this point in time. But been an awful lot of work and really enjoyable, and then we keep adding things to it. It's now been modified to, rather than having a machine gun on as it had originally, it's now actually got radio equipment in it, so it's a full signals Jeep. To actually commemorate my father-in-law, who was in Canadian Signals. And it's fitted out with all signals equipment, including a working radio in the back of it. Pattern on here, the blue and white indicates that it's a signals vehicle. The 51 indicates that it was part of the Governor General's Foot Guards during the European campaign. And obviously it carries on the other side the maple leaf on a dark green background, or a medium green background, which is I think it's the 4th Armoured Division, if I remember correctly, and hence the flashes that I have on the shoulder, that is the divisional sign for the 4th Armoured Division. And obviously instead of carrying the Governor General's Foot Guards shoulder flashes, they have the signals flashes and the Canada flashes, because signals were a completely separate group, and they were assigned to work with the regiments. But these days they're integrated into the regiment, so they would carry the regimental badges these days. Over on the side there, on the other side of the Jeep, there is a 19 set, which was the typical military set that was originally fitted into armoured vehicles, into tanks. But they found it was a really good set, transmitter receiver, very powerful. And so it was used, they were taken out of the wreck tanks and put into things like the Jeeps, because the Jeeps were small enough to be used very close to the front line, because they didn't have a high silhouette. So it made it safe to take a mobile radio, close to the fighting front. The vehicle's also fitted out with a generator so that we can recharge the batteries, because the voltage that the radio requires is 12 or 24 volts, and Jeeps only had a 6-volt system. So you can't power it off the vehicle battery. But this is a working radio. I'm not a radio amateur, so I'm not allowed to transmit with it, but we listen to it, and you can still pick up some shortwave signals on there, which includes things like the time clock in Ottawa, and also the Bible Belt down in the States, where they're really banging and thumping all about, that God will not treat you well if you do not believe in him, which is quite entertaining to listen to late at night. Other than that, it's all fitted out on the back also here with other aerials. There's a full set of aerials on that side, and then on the back here is a wire dispenser arrangement, which enables you to lay telephone wire, which could be linked through the radio system back to further behind or further forward to a field telephone, so that the radio can be linked through the telephone back to headquarters to relay information back there. And these obviously will allow you to lay cable as you drive along, which is much faster than trying to wind it out by hand. And other than that, it's just other general equipment on the vehicle that we hang on it for the show. We've got various bags with kit, because the soldiers would have hung all their kit on there. They lived in and around these vehicles in the wartime. So this was their mobile home, if you want, of the era. We fitted obviously the Canadian and the British use the Enfield rifle as their weapon, rather than the American weapons, which the holder would have been made for. This has now been modified to take the Canadian rifle on here. This would be the armament for the driver. He would carry that. Anybody else riding in here would be carrying their own weapons. And the driver would normally also have a full harness on, and he would carry a pistol on his hip, which I've not got on today. But that probably covers most of the things. The vehicle is fitted out with a fire extinguisher and a spade and an axe in case they get stuck somewhere. And I have arranged the vehicle so that it also carries the big aerial on the back, can be stowed on the side of the vehicle, so that they can put up an aerial for transmission work if they wanted to. And today we've got the Canadian flag on the top.
What were some of the big challenges that you had along the road to restoration with this vehicle?
When we bought the vehicle, there was no bodywork at all from here backwards, nothing. There was a bench seat and there was a homemade wooden body on the back, made of wood and hardboard, which was all corroding and falling to pieces. And when I ripped that body off, I discovered that all the cross members had been cut out. So the chassis had opened up like that, because we think a farmer maybe bought it after the war, and we think he put a round tank on it to use it, to take water or whatever out into the fields. So the chassis all had to be completely taken to pieces, straightened, cross members welded in, and there was a lot of rust on it and some very bad corrosion, so I had to patch it and put metal pieces into it. And then the windscreen was on it, but it was all totally rotten because it had been laying flat. But other than that, everything at the front of the Jeep was in fact still intact, although very battered and needed a lot of filling and sorting out. I then bought the sides. These are original pieces which came from France. The actual side and back panels are from a company called Hotchkiss in France, who built these Jeeps to exactly the same pattern towards the end of the war and after the war. So I was able to get original parts that actually look correct with all the bracketry on, and then I had to weld up and build all the bodywork inside, acquire all the pieces, and of course spent rather a lot of money on it over the years, as one does, as a hobby, which now makes it a bit more valuable than $70, which is what I paid for it in the beginning. I believe they're valued somewhere around about $30,000 over here in this country. But I've been reminded by my British friends, if I'd kept it in England, it would be worth even more, because there's even more demand for them over there than here.
What were some of the things that got you interested in sharing it with your club here?
Well, when I was in the UK, the first time I got involved in vehicles, military vehicles, was that in the factory that I worked, they had acquired an old Chevrolet C16, Canadian-made Chevrolet, built here in Oshawa for the British Army. And so I managed to acquire that vehicle because they weren't using it anymore, and drove that around for a few years and showed it off in the UK at shows. I then managed to find part of an artillery tractor as well, which I was going to renovate, and then in the end I came across the Jeep, and the Jeep was actually much easier and much more fun to build and actually drive around. And then ultimately I sold the other two vehicles before I came over here to Canada, which I rather regret, because the Canadian C15 that I bought was actually rather unique, because it was only a two-wheel drive vehicle, whereas all the Canadian ones were four-wheel drive. And it had been a British Army vehicle, and the British, of course, being the British, decided they only wanted two-wheel drive vehicles at the start of the war, and they learnt their lesson very quickly to go to four-wheel drive, because when you're in mud and bad ground, you've got a real problem driving one of those vehicles.
Do you like to speak on it when you go out to shows like this? Is that like
Yes, yeah. My wife's much better at speaking on it. She's far more knowledgeable than me in some respects on its history. She remembers things better than I do, I'm afraid.
When John was talking about, we did this in honor of my dad. Sadly, my dad never saw it. He passed away in 2004. He saw pictures of it, but of course we didn't get back to Canada until 2016, and he'd already passed away. But my mum, she'd hung on to the license plates, because of course he had specialized plates done with being RSM 703. And when it came time to bring the Jeep out, my mum said, yeah, right thing to do. Dad would have been really, really, really chuffed to have these plates on this Jeep, and it all be kitted out for Canadian signals. So yeah.
But the interesting thing was, we were able to ship it over here. We had to get an export license to get it out of the UK, because it was a Lend-Lease vehicle, and that still applies on any sort of ex-military wartime vehicle, need an export license. Not a problem, we managed to get that okay. We shipped it inside the shipping container along with all our household goods. And the only thing the customs were interested in was the Jeep. And they wanted to see it. And then when we went to the licensing office to get the plates put on, they all wanted to see it. They were absolutely fascinated.
Because we're filling out this form in the licensing bureau to say, because they want to know, like, what kind of a vehicle is it, Jeep? What year is it? 1942. Okay. Does it have seat belts? No. Does it have side doors? No.
Yeah. How many doors does it have?
None.
And they were fascinated. And the other thing was the British licensing document actually says that this document is of the keeper of the vehicle and is not guaranteed to, is not definitely the owner. So of course they had a problem on their hands because apparently I didn't have ownership. So they had to fax and telephone back and forth to the UK and get the licensing authority in the UK to say, no, that is the only document, because the person who keeps the vehicle is the one who is responsible for it and responsible for things like speeding tickets and parking fines.
Yeah, they don't actually have an ownership.
You don't have an ownership
document.
You have a keeper document.
You have a keeper document.
So in the end, they accepted it and gave me a proper ownership over here. The oddity about it is
you get wet when you drive in it.
At the end of the war, of course, there were lots and lots of surplus military vehicles all over the place. Lots of them damaged in one form or another. So this Jeep is what the Brits would call a bitzer. It's bits of this and bits of that. So it's a Ford chassis, Ford engine block, Ford transmission and everything in it. But the grille on the front of it actually belongs to a Willys. And it's a very early model Willys, what they call a slat grille. So that's not really the correct grille, but I'm not going to change it. And inside the cylinder head says Willys. So what they did was they obviously needed a new cylinder head, they needed a new grille. So they looked around, found another wrecked Jeep, took the pieces off that Jeep and bolted them on this and then sold it off to a civilian. So an awful lot of these vehicles came out of the civilian areas missing bits and pieces or the wrong bits fitted, as long as the vehicle was drivable. And that was all they were interested in actually getting the vehicles on the road and selling them to people. And this one was almost certainly sold to a farmer because he probably didn't have a tractor, or his tractor had it, and so he would use the Jeep for ploughing and other things like that at first, but they found they actually weren't that good for ploughing. And I know that the Bren gun carriers, which you still see around, and there's one on this site, they actually became quite popular on the bigger farms for ploughing, just because they had the power to do it. But these vehicles, same as in Canada and also down in the US, the Jeeps are still around, a lot of them, because they're such fun vehicles to drive around in.
Do you have any recommendations or advice or anything for anybody who's interested in maybe getting a Jeep or a restoration project similar for themselves?
Don't be put off by buying a vehicle that needs a lot of work on it if you're prepared to do the work. They're not cheap to buy, unfortunately,
That's
now
probably
because
the biggest reason to
they're
do
in
it
demand.
is because they're so
expensive.
This one the way it is now, I mean, there's one that is for sale over there and it's in very good shape, obviously. You're going to pay top dollar for it, so you're better to find something that is, you know,
that needs work
needs a
doing
lot of work,
if you can
and
find
then you
one.
can be able to afford it, because you're going to be laying out $30,000-$35,000 at a start, which is a lot of money.
Yeah.
You know, but you might be able to get something maybe for 5 or 10 that can't
Requires
even be
a lot
driven.
of work.
Yeah, it requires a lot of work, but if you can put it in,
you can build over a period of time, so you can go and buy the bits bit by bit and gradually build it up. This one took me about 3 years to build up into a usable condition where I could legally take it onto the road. And I've got one little funny story with it. My eldest daughter decided that she wanted to drive this thing just before the age of being allowed to drive legally. And we had a field opposite our house that actually had wooden power poles down the centre of the field bringing electricity to the village. My daughter's driving around the field at high speed in this Jeep. I was sat in the back, my other daughter sat in the other seat in the front. And my eldest daughter decided she didn't remember which side of the pole she was supposed to go and ended up hitting the pole dead centre. She bent the front bumper right back in. The pole broke off at ground level but remained connected to the wires above, and it hit the top of the windscreen, broke the windscreen back. My younger daughter and my elder daughter, who was driving, both ducked, and I had to duck quickly as the pole passed over my head. And that cost me a lot of money to pay the electricity company to replace the pole. But luckily it didn't cause a short circuit in the village or cut the power out, because the pole remained hanging on the wires, but the bottom was totally rotten, and that's why it had broken away from the ground. So we were lucky not to be seriously hurt. And I never let her forget that. That's her first attempt at driving.
Never let her drive it again either.
I don't know that I did. No, I probably didn't ever let her drive it again. She's now living in Australia, so she's far enough away not to be able to get near it.